The architectural historian Charles Jenks pointed out that one can date the death of the modern movement not just to the decade or to the year, but to the minute. It happened in St. Louis, where the architect Minoru Yamasaki had designed a large low-income housing project. Its name was Pruitt-Igoe. Tower blocks, parks, recreational streets inside the buildings, every sort of Corbusian amenity. Most improving. The architectural magazines made a fuss over it. It won awards. That was in 1951. Within a few years, the place had been ripped apart by its unimproved tenants. Old and middle-aged people were scared to live there, and the young were in the corridors with flick knives. Pruitt-Igoe got so bad that in 1972, major structural alterations were called for.
I've always believed that this land was placed here between the two great oceans by some divine plan. It was placed here to be found by a special kind of people. People who had a special love for freedom and who had the courage to come to what in the beginning was the most undeveloped wilderness possible.
Ronald Reagan's immense appeal to Americans lay in offering them the rebirth of an America that had been lost in the conflicts and humiliations of the 60s and 70s. Victorious, leading the world, buoyant with the virtues of the mythic West.
For 200 years, we've lived in the future, believing that tomorrow would be better than today and today would be better than yesterday. I still believe that. We can meet our destiny, and that destiny to build a land here that will be for all mankind a shining city on a hill.
This is not the Oval Office of the White House in Washington. It is in the Simi Valley, north of Los Angeles, in the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, a movie-set replica of the real stage on which the former actor worked in real life. Ronald Reagan, like most American presidents, including John Kennedy, had no particular interest in the visual arts, beyond film, of course. Yet his presidency had large indirect effects upon the American art world, more perhaps than anyone's since Franklin Roosevelt's. Why? Because in the course of quadrupling America's national deficit to about $1 trillion and filling the country with oceans of borrowed money, his economic policies created the art boom of the 1980s. This bubble had a blinding iridescence while it lasted, and every new investor was aware that if he bought new art, he'd come up smelling like Lorenzo de Medici's aftershave.
Pace Gallery.
The art dealers, of course, were high in hog heaven, floating on clouds of sanctimony.
Maria? I know most of the people who are collecting in the art world, whether they buy from me or not, and I probably will know something about you. And then I'll have to make a judgment. Will I take a chance on affiliating you to the gallery by letting you have one of these paintings? Now, that sounds terribly arrogant, but it's true. Anybody who gets one of these paintings is receiving a prize.
A booby prize sometimes, like a Julian Schnabel. His congested paintings with their broken plates and earnest, incompetent drawing made him a great favourite among those who yearned for the hot and the heavy. Schnabel was a monument of self-esteem who once compared himself to Giotto and Van Gogh. The patron saint of this inflation was Andy Warhol. It was Andy who demystified the art world by calling it by its real name, a business, a promotional system swept by tides of fashion and snobbery. After his death in 1987, there was a giant auction of his things. Andy must have been smiling down from heaven when his flea market cookie jars came on the block and the relic hunters went crazy.
At $18,000, $19,000, on the right. At 20,000, 21,000. At 21,000, fair warning. $21,000.
If cheap cookie jars could become treasures in the 1980s, then how much more the work of the very egregious Jeff Hughes, a former bond trader whose ambitions took him right through kitsch and out the other side into a vulgarity so syrupy, gross and numbing that collectors felt challenged by it. Sometimes his work was at least memorable, like this inflatable toy rabbit cast in stainless steel and turned into a parody of Brancusi's birds. He didn't make his own stuff, of course. No doubt Hughes couldn't carve his name on a tree. He had European souvenir factories do that, creating delicious porcelain treasures to his design, like Michael Jackson with bubbles, and Leonardo's St. John. This little piggy went to market in a big way, for Hughes sees himself as a spiritual artist. Accusing him of hype is like rebuking a fish for being wet.
Hi, Jeff. A kitten in a giant sock. Tell me about it.
This is one of my newer works that I'm creating. And I think that it's a piece that's working in kind of a very classical tradition of a crucifixion. And this is very open. It's more fun-loving in a way, and also deal with a spiritual theme.
Well, I don't see much spirituality there yet. I see a very large and playful pussycat in a sock, but how are you going to inject spirituality into this image?
I'm going to give the cat a little more Bambi-like eyelashes.
Ah, very spiritual Bambi, yeah.
And I think that the flowers are really quite beautiful. They're very, very Baroque. I try to make works, pardon me, that are very generous. I try to be as generous as I can be with myself.
What do you mean by generous? I mean, how is this more generous, say, than some other kind of sculpture? What's generous about it?
Well, I think that it's communicating love, it's communicating happiness, and it doesn't alienate anyone. I think that a young child could come in here, a 5-year-old child could look and find some pleasure and some enjoyment, and I hope that it's something positive for humankind.
Have you ever actually done any carving or modeling?
No. When I was a child, I did some modeling. But
what, with plasticine or modeling clay?
But now we're working here in my New York studio, and I have a staff of artists that I work with, which are really quite phenomenal.
So you think the stuff up, but you don't make it?
That's correct. I have to oversee everything here, and I have to make every decision. Otherwise, I'd have no relation to it at all.